It is often said that Chinese people measure time in a different way from everyone else. So, from their perspective, 20 years really isn't that long. Yet, during that 20 years, an awful lot has happened in Hong Kong. Health scares, corruption scandals, political upheaval, riots and protests. Lots of protests. The 2014 demonstrations were the largest in a Chinese city since those in Beijing 25 years earlier. And like the Tiananmen Square protests, these were also led by students wanting more democracy. They also exposed some deep divisions in society. One of the demands of the umbrella movement, as it came to be known, was free elections for Hong Kong's leaders, without Beijing approving the candidates. In that quest, they failed. The protests gradually lost momentum. Now, almost 3 years on, there remains huge uncertainty about where Hong Kong is headed. Before the handover, Britain and China signed an agreement that promised that Hong Kong would be governed by a one-country, two-systems formula. Hong Kong would remain an integral part of China, but for 50 years, its economic, political and judicial freedoms would continue. It was the start of a unique experiment, but China is now indicating that that experiment has run its course. The 20th anniversary of the handover was another hugely symbolic moment for China's leaders, and a very nervous one for Hong Kong officials. It was President Xi Jinping's first visit to Hong Kong as head of state. The heavy security kept protesters well away from him, but he would have been in no doubt about the depth of their anger. The president's most important duty was to oversee the swearing-in ceremony of Hong Kong's new chief executive. Carrie Lam was selected by a committee of 1,200 members. Voters had absolutely no say. Lam was picked because of her unambiguous loyalty to China's Communist Party, and for China's leadership, loyalty is the #1 priority right now. In a tough but tempered speech, President Xi had a warning for those intending to undermine China's sovereignty in Hong Kong.
Any attempt to endanger China's sovereignty and security, challenge the power of the central government, or use Hong Kong to carry out infiltration and sabotage activities against the mainland is an act that crosses the red line and is absolutely impermissible.
June and July are often the wettest months in Hong Kong. 2 decades earlier, British colonial rule had ended in a tropical downpour. There was excitement, but also trepidation. Could communist China really be trusted to run the world's freest economy? It was a very emotional day.
It's important for
Joshua Wong wasn't even a year old when the handover happened. He's a symbol of the umbrella movement. He's been arrested twice and admits he's a step away from prison. Yet his activism goes on. Here, helping cover up the statue symbolizing Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule. The mainland's media has branded Wong an extremist, race traitor and enemy of the state. But in the space of just a few years, he's attained almost celebrity status.
What we hope to do is just demand freedom of mind and freedom of speech. It's not Hong Kong anymore.
And a just-released documentary portrays his campaign for greater autonomy for Hong Kong. Today, Wong says the one-country, two-systems formula is almost dead, and he blames interference by Chinese officials. Joshua Wong, do you consider Hong Kong to be a separate country?
I consider Hong Kong remain its uniqueness and different with the system with mainland China.
So you do believe it's independent of China?
No doubt that now Hong Kong is part of China and we are under the rule of the Communist Party. But the fact is, what I hope is to fight for democracy and autonomy in this city. And when I recognize Hong Kong as a unique city, as my hometown, what I hope is China should respect the promise in the joint declaration and let Hong Kong people to have democracy, to freely elect the leader.
Do you think Hong Kong will ever be independent of China?
I'm not the one to advocate Hong Kong's independence, but I'm the one who fight for autonomy and against the interference of China towards Hong Kong. As we promise to have high degree of autonomy in the international treaty, which means the joint declaration, I wonder why China government, especially under the hard line of President Xi, continue to ignore its promise. And that's why we, especially for young generation, we just conclude one country, two system in the 20th anniversary seems to be a lie to Hong Kong people.
The new chief executive, Carrie Lam, has said that she'll push for a new security law known as Article 23 to counter the independence sentiment in Hong Kong. Do you think that would bring people like you and others who support you back onto the streets?
Absolutely. In 2003, just because of the proposal to implement Article 23, the national security law, is just resulted in more than 500,000 people in Hong Kong. They just come to the street and to generate the largest rally in Hong Kong in this century. And at the same time, we also realize that if the China government continue to ignore its promise in the one country, two system, which would be the basic law to allow people to have high degree of autonomy, the result is people will be more dissatisfied and would ready to come to the street.
Do you think you will see full democracy in Hong Kong in your lifetime?
I hope to see full democracy in Hong Kong in my lifetime, but whether Hong Kong can implement or achieve democracy or not, it not depends on me. It depends on Hong Kong people and also international community.
But if you had accepted what China had offered you, which was a chance to elect your own leader, albeit a committee would vet who those leaders could be, who those candidates could be, you would have stood the possibility of perhaps having that 2047 deadline extended. But that's now gone.
I would say that genuine democracy and universal suffrage means that the candidate of the election should not face any selection or pre-screening process from the pro-China camp or the China government. If only the one who loyal to Communist Party of China can be the candidate in the chief executive election, and the election is meaningless because they don't exist true competition. And what I mean is, even we can elect the chief executive of Hong Kong with full democracy now, but it can just implement until 2047 because in the International Treaty of Joint Declaration, it did not mention what will be the further arrangement to cross beyond 2047.
Can you imagine yourself being here after 2047 when this becomes just another Chinese city?
That's the reason for me to fight for democracy in Hong Kong. Because if we keep silence and do nothing, I'm just afraid 1 or 2 decades later, Hong Kong would just turn to be another mainland China city. And that's the reason for me to fight for my future.
You speak to a lot of ordinary people down there. Their priority is not democratic reform. Their priority is better welfare, better education and affordable housing. Those are the issues that really matter most to Hong Kong people, it seems. Why not focus on those issues which present, more attainable targets?
According to the last election result of the Legislative Council, pro-democracy camp that put democracy and political system reform as the highest priority, our camp get 60% of votes in the direct election, which proved that we are the majority, and the pro-China camp with only 35% of support in the vote, they are the minority.
If you had 5 minutes alone with Xi Jinping, what would you say to him?
My only recommendation to President Xi is please rely on your promise in the joint declaration and let us get a chance to elect the leader of our city. And that's your promise.
Hong Kong enjoys more freedoms than any other part of China. Why can't you accept that this is essentially going to be as good as it gets?
Economic freedom and judicial independence will be eroded if it's lack of democracy. But I think as the only city in China have certain degree of freedom, we are not the one who only bear the responsibility to push forward democratization in Hong Kong. We will also hope to push forward democracy in China.
So you can understand now why the Chinese leadership regards you as an enemy of the state. They believe that you want to try and bring down the Chinese Communist Party.
I doubt why ask for democracy for the country that I live will be recognized as the enemy of the state. What I ask for is ending one-party dictatorship. What I mean is we hope to have true competition for the leader of China instead of only one Communist Party of China would lead China forever.
It's fair to say that Joshua Wong has been one of the defining figures of recent Hong Kong history. 20 years ago, another figure loomed large here, and he too was reviled by mainland authorities. His name was Chris Patten, and he was Britain's last governor of Hong Kong. He was popular and very sympathetic to calls for more democracy. In his final speech as governor, he said Britain would keep the promises it had made to the people of Hong Kong, that its way of life would continue for 50 years. My colleague, Felicity BARR, has been speaking to Mr. Patten about his reflections 20 years on.
Chris Patten, in your new book, you describe your experience as Governor of Hong Kong as the most interesting and worthwhile 5 years of your life. So, looking back 20 years ago, do you recall how you were feeling? You were holding the folded Union flag at that handover ceremony. What was going through your mind then?
So the job of being mayor, as it were, of Hong Kong was terrific. And the job of negotiating with the Chinese, I wouldn't say was terrific because I was dealing with what's called the struggle school of diplomacy. But nevertheless, it was challenging, to use a polite word, and one was always aware of the really big issues for everyone concerned in those negotiations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in your final speech as governor, you said Britain had provided the scaffolding that enabled the people of Hong Kong to ascend. To what extent do you think is that scaffolding now falling apart?
I don't think it's falling apart, but I think it's threatened by Chinese behaviour. They've certainly pulled away one or two struts. And why has that happened? For the first few years after the handover, while China rode back some of the proposals on freer and fairer elections, by and large they let things stand. But I think what's happened since President Xi Jinping has been in office is that just as he's cracked down on dissidents in China, like the Nobel Peace Prize winner who's unfortunately dying just out of prison hospital of cancer. Just as he's cracked down on dissidents, he's also increased the tightness of the grip that China has on Hong Kong's windpipe. And that's a worry because Hong Kong is guaranteed its freedoms under an international treaty between Britain and China. And I think also a lot of people will look at how China behaves in Hong Kong as an indication of whether or not you can trust China in the 21st century.
How concerned are you about how divided parts of Hong Kong are, and is there any way actually to heal that rift? Presumably not easily.
I think the divisions are a result of China's behaviour, of the behaviour of the Communist Party in China. It must be profoundly unsettling for the Chinese authorities to discover that the majority of young people in Hong Kong don't want to think of themselves in any way as dwelling under the same roof as the Chinese Politburo. I mean, they find the Chinese Beijing view of the world very different from their own, and you see all that in opinion polls about people's sense of their own identity. It's one of the things I've written about in my book. So that must be unsettling for the authorities in Beijing, if that is, they take any notice at all.
When those sort of pro-democracy protests started happening, we know and we saw the pictures of people being tear-gassed in the streets at those demonstrations. What was notable by its absence here was any sort of mention from the British government about what was happening in Hong Kong. And I guess some people there do feel betrayed, don't they? Yes,
they do. I mean, during that period, there were one or two slightly nervous clearings of the throat by people in the Foreign Office and elsewhere.
But not more than that.
But not much more than that.
How much then has Britain failed in its responsibilities to the people of Hong Kong? You were there right at the very end. You made that promise that the UK would fulfil its responsibilities.
I think there were some things we could have done better. But by and large, I think we made a pretty good fist of running Hong Kong, and we handed over a going concern. One of my advisors said that he couldn't understand why the Chinese didn't recognise that we'd given them the keys to a Rolls Royce, and all they had to do was to turn on the ignition and off she'd pop. But that's the truth of the matter. We had handed over a city, a territory, which was to a considerable extent made up of refugees from some of the awful events in modern Chinese history. The Great Famine, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. People who had swum to Hong Kong, people who'd clambered over barbed wire fences in order to get away from the mainland. So it was a city very largely made up of refugees and immigrants from mainland China, and you can't expect them to view with huge enthusiasm being back in China's grasp.
So, 20 years on, what is happening to the one country, two systems formula, which is supposed to keep Hong Kong separate from China? Well, critics say that formula has been undermined by China's behind-the-scenes meddling in local politics. Many also worry that Hong Kong is simply being recolonised. 12% of the population is now mainland Chinese, and they are not popular. Let's go back to Adrian Brown for more.
Many people in Hong Kong will tell you that 20 years after the handover, there is not much to celebrate. Yes, it remains the freest city in China, but there are deepening concerns that the leadership in Beijing is tightening its grip on some of those cherished freedoms. The recent disappearance of 5 local booksellers, reportedly abducted by mainland agents, shocked some people already concerned about rule of law under China. One top Chinese official has even warned that calls for independence are enough to justify China walking away from the deal it signed with Britain. Jasper Sangyok Singh founded Hong Kong's biggest pro-Beijing party and is a former president of the Legislative Assembly, Hong Kong's mini parliament. What were your thoughts on the night of June the 30th, 1997, as you saw the Union Jack being lowered, the Hong Kong flag, the Chinese flag being raised? What was your overriding emotion at that time, if you can recall?
I think, like most other people in Hong Kong, we were more, let's say, more optimistic than we should have been. We took a rather simplistic view. So I think that was the feeling among most of us, whether pro-Beijing, pro-democracy, anyone. So now that the British are going away, we are now masters of our own house. So let's get up and do something for Hong Kong.
Now we're 20 years on from 1997. Society seems more divided now, particularly politically.
Our society has always been divided, as I see it. You know, back in the 1960s, there were the leftists and then the other people. Or there were the nationalists then as well. I mean, the Kuomintang supporters then, fighting against each other. So the community in Hong Kong has always been divided.
Has China stuck to its side of the agreement?
Well, let people point out which promises China made have been broken by the Chinese government. Please.
Well, what about the booksellers who disappeared? What about
them?
tycoons who vanished from their hotels in Hong Kong?
What happened? What?
They were taken by Chinese agents.
They
were taken by Chinese agents.
Were they? Well, at least one of them openly said in Hong Kong, in a press conference, that it was not so. That he went to the mainland voluntarily. Believe him or not, right? Other things happened outside Hong Kong, not in Hong Kong. So now we don't know, but the only, I believe, indisputable fact about that incident, the booksellers incident, is no one in authority in China has come out and said, look, we have the power to come and grab people in Hong Kong.
But why would they say that?
Well, some people may think that they have such power. But no, if someone says this, then you can definitely say that is breaking a promise.
So there's no proof, you're saying, that China was behind these disappearances?
There's no proof, or there's no reason, whatever, that we should believe that anyone in authority in China has deliberately broken the rules in one country, two systems.
You have said that you want to try to heal the rift between Hong Kong and China. What is that rift?
What I said, I believe, was I wanted very much to see the rift sort of bridged. Not that I, as an individual, think that I have the power or I have the ability.
So how can that rift be healed, do you think?
My basic belief is Hong Kong people, on the one hand, must realize that one country, two systems is China's policy on Hong Kong. It is the Chinese Communist Party's policy on Hong Kong. The policy will continue as long as the Chinese government and as long as the Chinese Communist Party believes that it is good for the country.
A lot of people have said that you would actually make a great chief executive because you were a committed communist in your youth. You've contributed to the community by being a headmaster. You were president of LegCo. You founded the biggest pro-Beijing party. You tick all the right boxes. What went wrong?
Well, ability and competence aside, no one can become a really good chief executive of Hong Kong unless he or she has the trust of both Hong Kong people and the central government. My sort of way of thinking does not agree very much with the officers in charge of Hong Kong affairs. So this is it.
Let me ask you this. If there was a free election in Hong Kong, universal suffrage, isn't it the case that actually the pro-Beijing candidate would probably win?
But that's what I believe. That's what I believe. You couldn't, I mean...
So why doesn't China allow it to happen? Because probably, actually, their candidate would win.
To the Chinese leaders, to the officials looking at Hong Kong affairs, they say, how can you tell? How can you tell? I mean, it seems inconceivable today that anyone coming from the pan-democratic camp can be elected the chief executive. But you know, politics is unpredictable.
20 years ago, you very rarely heard people openly calling for independence in Hong Kong. You hear that now, admittedly from a minority. Can you understand why people are calling for independence, and is it really attainable?
I think the most obvious reason is, of course, young people, some young people, are losing their confidence in one country, two systems. It is this worry, this fear that their lifestyle, the way of life in Hong Kong is going to change in the near future.
To China, it seems that Hong Kong sometimes behaves like a spoilt teenager, always asking for more, never happy. But Hong Kong would probably reply, the decades of freedom that have helped to make this place the economic envy of the world are worth fighting to protect. The problem is, China's mood is changing fast, and so this tale could yet have a very unhappy ending.